Welcome to the Point. This week, U.S. Senator Gary Peters visited the West Michigan Vaccine Clinic at DeVos Place. While he was there, we talked with him about the continuing fight against the pandemic and his efforts to protect our manufacturing supply chain and bring more manufacturing to the United States. Senator, here we are in person, distanced, but we are coming to a point where we're starting to see vaccination levels at points where public health officials and others are feeling more confident about battling this pandemic. And one of the reasons is this clinic where we're sitting in Grand Rapids. You just toured it. Tell me a little bit about your takeaways from talking to the medical professionals here and seeing this operation.
Well, this is just an incredible operation, and it's really a testament to the local community coming together from all sorts of different agencies, the massive volunteers that are here working to make sure that we get this vaccine out as quickly as possible, and it is a great effort, and folks in the Grand Rapids area need to be very proud of this effort. You know, I work closely with FEMA. I'm chair of Homeland Security Committee. We oversee FEMA. We were able to provide additional resources in the rescue plan to set up these kinds of mass vaccination sites because we know from a scientific standpoint it's important to get it in arms quickly as possible because of the potential for variants to rise up. You got to protect people so those variants don't arise from the mutations, and what we see here is clearly outstanding. In fact, I was told as I was looking at the numbers, well over 200,000 people have been vaccinated at this site alone, and folks from Spectrum Health, who I toured with today, said that they had a surge. We've just gotten through the surge. Hopefully it's starting to come down a little bit, but they're confident that that surge would have been a whole lot worse had it not been for this facility being here.
You're not a medical professional, so we'll stipulate that, but I know that from Homeland Security and the briefings you get and the experts that you talk to, how confident are you that we as a nation can get to something that looks like herd immunity, and is there any projection when that could happen?
Well, I'm confident we can do it, but it's incumbent on all of us to get those shots. And there is hesitancy. We talked about that today, that folks have questions. Unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation that's been put out about this as well. And that's why it's important to have a public education campaign. Part of the resources we're putting into local communities from the federal level to make sure that people are acting on facts. People want to know the facts. They have a right to know the facts. They need to know the facts. And when they have a chance to explore those facts, they're going to see this vaccine is safe, it's highly effective, and it's the way that we get to the other side of this pandemic.
I want to switch subjects. You have been talking a lot recently about manufacturing. No surprise, you're a senator from Michigan. That would kind of be in your ballpark. But you've got some pretty specifics that you're working on, particularly too concerning automotive. And I mean, I think there's some real concerns that may be coming to the forefront on that. Talk a little bit about what your focus has been when it comes to Michigan manufacturing.
Well, manufacturing needs to be a focus in this country, and the fact is pretty clear in my mind. You can't be a great country if you don't actually make things. Manufacturing is absolutely critical. Our competitors around the world know that. They invest and they support their manufacturers. Think of the Germans, think of the South Koreans and others that are highly successful. We need to do that in this country as well and have a coordinated policy to support manufacturers, particularly small manufacturers, the intermediate size that are all throughout the Grand Rapids area, a very vibrant ecosystem here. But how do we provide support and plug some of the gaps? So there are a couple areas. One, I'm looking at the creation of a National Institute of Manufacturing, patterned after the National Institute of Health, which is a very effective, very successful government agency. And how that works is it basically will coordinate all the work that we're doing right now at the federal level. There are 58 manufacturing programs in the federal government. They're spread out over 11 different federal agencies. There's duplication, there's waste. There's no one voice saying this is what our small manufacturers need. That's why we're working to get that done, and we'll hopefully have it in legislation coming up shortly. And the second area is the supply chain, is that we have to have resilient supply chains. This pandemic has showed us very clearly that we are overly dependent on foreign sources for things like critical medicines, for critical medical supplies. They're not resilient. We're seeing right now to the auto industry the reliance on chips, these semiconductors. This is now we're laying off folks. Production has been slowed down as a result of that. And we've got to make sure that we're making these critical components in the United States with American workers. How do we make sure we have that resilience in our supply chain?
On the issue of the automotive industry, and this is an area that I have talked to people both in manufacturing and people who are doing retail, and they're really concerned about an already critical shortage in used vehicles. If you drive by your local dealership, those lots that used to be filled are pretty bare. And if the semiconductors continue to be in short supply, new cars are going to be harder to come by. How concerned are you about that as that would impact us in Michigan in ways that it wouldn't other places?
Well, I'm very concerned that you'll see production of new cars. Already we're seeing that being curtailed. It's difficult to know when those supplies are going to be coming in. Depends on what expert you talk to, but certainly it's going to be a problem through the rest of this year. I think there's pretty broad consensus about that. Then the question is, how far into 2022 do we go? So that has an impact on jobs without question, which is why we have to be focused on supply chains in a way that we haven't been in the past, particularly when you see kinds of market disruptions. We see something like a pandemic. Hopefully that's not going to happen for a long time, but there will be other kinds of distributions. And the markets don't necessarily think that way. They're always just driving for efficiency, whatever is the most efficient today. But we have to understand that there needs to be other considerations, and that's where a role where government could play a role to incentivize onshoring production here into the United States so that you're not dependent on foreign sources for whatever that industry may be.
One of the things that the focus will be for automotive will be transitioning the fleet to electric vehicles, and as we do that, the government has a role to play in that you spoke about, and it has to do with the president's plan, his big infrastructure plan that he laid out, also his American Families Plan that he laid out in a joint address to Congress. Talk to me first about that infrastructure plan, because that would be the biggest, most sweeping plan of our lifetimes for the government to undertake in terms of infrastructure. Talk about what it might do, and also talk about how you might get there with reluctant Republican senators.
Well, we have to have a very broad definition of what infrastructure is in the 21st century. Roads and bridges clearly are infrastructure, but that goes back to the last century. And if you look, for example, at electrifying the fleet, which our automakers are moving aggressively to do that, whether it's General Motors or Chrysler or Ford. I just recently had a meeting with Ford engineers who talked about where they are in terms of electrifying their fleet and how they need to build charging stations for their customers, even though most customers will never outdrive their charge in any given day. People still want to know if they're taking a trip that they have access to that. But you're going to need to have more than private industry to do that. You're going to need to have infrastructure building those stations, at least to get it jump started. And when you think back at the beginning of the last century, cars were not as exciting for folks when you had dirt roads and mud roads, and so the government needed to pave roads. As roads got paved, people bought more cars, and it becomes kind of a virtuous cycle. Same thing with the electrifying of the fleet and having that infrastructure in place. And so that's why those investments need to be made. It's certainly what our domestic auto companies are asking for.
This is an extraordinary plan in terms of overall cost and the width of this thing, because it's everything from broadband to charging stations to bridges and roads. And Republicans have said, wait a minute, if you want to do bridges and roads and broadband or whatever it is, do this. But as a whole, their opposition has been that it's too broad and it's too tall from an expense standpoint. So you got 50 colleagues in Washington, you got to get some of them or change the rules. So what's it going to be? How's that going to work out?
Well, it has to be broad, and this is an investment. So first off, this is about investing in our country. And when you invest, you get a return on the investment. And when you're talking about infrastructure investments, you're talking about decades of economic return that come back to you. And it has to be forward-looking. If you're going to be really efficient with that investment, you want to be forward-looking. And I like an example that was given where the country went on a big push to build airports. And folks said, you know, where are airplanes going to be? Why are we taking this valuable space and turning it into runways and airports? Now, try to build a new airport today, it's almost impossible. It was that kind of forethought that allowed us to put in the infrastructure in place for air transportation, which transformed our country. We have to be thinking in those terms. So hopefully we'll be able to build a bipartisan consensus to do that. We should. Most folks agree that infrastructure is a long-term investment. Always the sticking point tends to be how you pay for it, and we do have to pay for it as well as we go forward. And then certainly the president has outlined some proposals in that area. I hope we can build that consensus.
When you think of the way the Senate works today, and when you see what's happened since President Biden has taken office, there has been a whole lot of go it alone, it seems like. There have been a lot of executive orders that were done. The most critical, I would think, bill that has passed since that time has come around was for COVID relief, and that was done on straight party votes. How do you break that cycle, if you break that cycle? And if you don't, do you do away with the so-called filibuster, which is not what it used to be, what it was actually a filibuster where people talked? And if that happens, and I know there are a lot of ifs in this question, but if that happens, doesn't that fundamentally change the Senate and make it much more reflective of perhaps the House, where you only have to have a simple majority?
Well, certainly, if you look at any of these big investments, you want to have broad support within the country. And I think it's important for us to look not just members of Congress to reflect what the country is saying, but to look at public opinion polls, look at local officials. If you look at the rescue plan that just passed, it passes, you mentioned, with just a party line vote. Not one Republican voted for it, either in the House and Senate. And yet, if you look at public opinion polls, well over 70% of the American people say this was really a good piece of legislation. This was the type of help that we needed to get through this pandemic. So when you have 70% of folks agreeing, that's pretty bipartisan. There are very few things we do in Washington that has over 70% approval, and yet it did not receive one Republican vote. So that may tell me those Republican senators and House members are just out of touch with the folks back home who understood that this was something that was necessary. And we have broad support from Republican governors, Republican mayors, other local officials. So it was bipartisan in that extent. So I would hope that anything we do in the future, my colleagues will take a look at what we need to do as a country, take that long-term view, understand the American people, expect folks to step up, come together, and do things that will have a meaningful impact in their lives going forward. To get to that bipartisanship. If not, there is the reconciliation that allows us to move forward with a majority vote, and that's something that will be there. But I know it's certainly my desire, I think it's the president's desire, I know it is, to try to do this in a bipartisan way.
And finally, the president talked a lot about changing Washington and building bipartisan cooperation and trying to essentially bring people back together so they could work together. We've just spent the last few minutes explaining that hasn't been the case up to now. Is there anything he can do as a long-term member of the U.S. Senate? I mean, he understands that body as well as anybody. Is there anything that he can do to foster more cooperation, or is the legislature, if not the country, just that divided?
Well, I think we have to recognize there's certainly clear divisions in the country, but I would say that the Congress is more divided than the country as a whole, is why, for the reasons I just mentioned, that a bill that had broad support around the country yet could not garner one single Republican vote. So I know the president is attempting to reach out to my colleagues. It's something I do. You know, I take great pride in working in a bipartisan way. I'm ranked one of the most bipartisan Democratic senators in the Senate, building those kinds of relationships. Certainly President Biden knows how that works. He spent a lot of time in the Senate, although today's Senate is a lot different than the one that he served in because of the dynamics that are happening in the country right now. But I know he's making those efforts. I'm going to continue to make those efforts. But just to put it in a sense of how difficult this is, we're working on a competitiveness package that will incorporate some of the work I'm doing in manufacturing and my colleagues and bills that I have introduced that will be part of that bill. I've introduced on a bipartisan way. I have a Republican co-sponsor. I have Republican support for these proposals. And we have a number of that in this competitiveness bill. We were supposed to vote on it last week. It came to the committee, and the Republicans put in over 250 amendments in committee. That's simply unheard of, and that's not good faith in my mind. They were simply trying to bury the bill and stop it. And I would hope that they would stop that. That we should all come together as a country in a bipartisan way and understand we need to compete with the Chinese. We need to compete with other foreign countries, and we need to step up and make sure we're as competitive as possible. And we can find common ground. We can do that in a bipartisan way. Don't put in 250 amendments at the last minute trying to kill a bill that could make a difference in Americans' lives. We got to move beyond that.
Senator Peters referenced 200,000 individuals going through the clinic. It's actually 200,000 shots that have been delivered in the short time since the clinic has been open. When we come back, is there another growing battle between the legislature and Governor Whitmer? We'll talk with one lawmaker that thinks so That's next, To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. It comes as no surprise that Republican legislators and the governor share very little in common when it comes to COVID policy. Now, new administrative rules proposed by MIOSHA have lawmakers crying foul. We talked with Representative Luke Meerman from Ottawa County about that. Representative, I want to talk about a process that you're kind of in the middle of right now, something called the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules. And I must tell you, I don't think I've ever been to one of those meetings or one of those hearings, but all of a sudden, this becomes kind of a flashpoint because of what's going on with some of the rules that are being considered. But first, talk to me about the committee and the committee's responsibility and what it does.
Absolutely. Yes, you're right. And a lot of people haven't heard about it, and it's not often a really sought after chairmanship, honestly. But I won't get into it, but I will tell you that before 2000, it was the most sought after chairmanship. So that could be a different discussion, but it is where the rules promulgation happens. So if a department wants or needs to promulgate some rules, whether or not the lawmakers just wrote a law or there is a time frame that, these rules need to be updated, those rules come through JCAR, and it's a joint committee, one of the few. So it's made up of senators and representatives. And again, those proposed rules from departments come through our JCAR committee.
So that's the process that's going on now, and some of the rules that are being considered have caused you considerable concern. In fact, in a release, I think you said that you believed that what was going on was the governor trying to kind of move some of her executive orders into MIOSHA. So tell me what's going on. First of all, it concerns the Occupational Health and Safety Department and some rules that are being written. So tell me about them, and then we'll get into your objections.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, and the governor states that clearly, the department states that clearly that, in October, their second 6 months extension by which they're operating under now. So Department of Health and Human Services, their second 6 months extension ends October. I believe it's October 14. So their intention is, hey, we don't think the pandemic's going to be over. We need the ability to continue to, tell businesses and employees how they should risk mitigate, the COVID situation. So that's why they're coming to us with these rules. Like you said, I have some really big concerns.
Well, talk to me about those concerns. What do the rules say? For example, do they continue social distancing and mask wearing in businesses, right?
Yes, that's correct. Almost anything you see happening today or have seen happen in the past is written into permanently MIOSHA's rules going forward. I don't expect them to say, every business forever after is ever going to wear a mask. But my big problem with that is that the department has that ability forever forward to decide that. And I think that completely cuts out the legislative process and the people's voice via their legislators.
So I want to make sure I understand the premise. They would write these rules and they would not necessarily implement them, but at any time that it was deemed necessary by presumably any governor who wanted to say to this department, do this, then they could implement masks, social distancing, and whatever else they're writing into these rules.
Absolutely. Yep, that's exactly right.
So what is the ability, what is the process, I guess, going forward? So they put together the rules and then they come to your committee and your committee has to approve or disapprove. Is that how it works?
Yes, and that rules promulgation. So May 24, there will be a public hearing where public can give input, and they're supposed to take into account that input and then decide if they're going to move forward as is, or going to make some changes, and then give the rules to JCAR. And I guess what I'm referring to as in 2018, when Snyder left, there was a few tools put back in the toolbox of JCAR, because in 2000 there was a court case that was lost under Engler. But now after 2018, there is some tools that we're gonna exercise.
Okay, we'll talk about that to the degree that you can. I mean, do you have the final say over these administrative rules, or does this become a tug of war between you and the department and the governor.
Yeah, I think it is that kind of tug of war, and you know, it might possibly end up in the court system. One of the things that concerns me most is the unchecked growth of the bureaucratic state. And I'm answering your question here, but for me, it's very personal that, you know, a department could promulgate rules without any input from the legislature. And that's kind of what's happened in the past in JCAR. And now that we have these new tools in a toolbox, I do think that we can use some of them to ask for changes and you know, give them back to the department. We need these changes. You need to change these. We're going to have hearings at JCAR, and business owners will be able to come in and talk about how this would affect them. And then we can also possibly propose legislation of our own, which gives us 270 calendar days in the Senate and the House.
So as you look at this, obviously, and you and I were talking just before we started this interview, we have seen over the past year plus now the real struggles that all of us have had, in some people who have had it much, much more difficult, and understanding that COVID has been a real issue. But at the state government level, there has continued to be this kind of back and forth between the administration and the legislature. Does this feel to you like this is kind of a continuation of that animosity that has been building over the past 14 months or so?
Yes, it is a continuation, and it's the continuation, I think, of the governor's office, you know, wanting to continue to tell us, we know best, you need to listen to us. And I know these are hard situations, and this whole pandemic is a very difficult situation. But the idea that the legislature, you know, by her design, has been left out of the picture for a year, I think is dangerous for democracy, our grand republic, at the end of the day. And yeah, I view this as an extension. What encourages me is I think we can really have an impact on these rules, and I'm looking forward to doing just that.
So you did mention a moment ago, and I just want to clarify this before we wrap up. You said that this could end up in the courts. I mean, so from your perspective, is it most likely that this is going to have to go to the judicial branch to get settled because the administration, the legislature aren't going to be able to come to a deal?
No, I don't think it will. I do think the tools in our toolbox are pretty legitimate, but I could see her thinking that maybe she has to take us to court. But I think this is the very thing that JCAR should be here to do, is, again, you know, to stand between the people and a bureaucracy that has decided, you know, to promulgate rules. And if the people's voice can't be heard here in this process through JCAR, via their legislators, I think it's a dangerous world.
Hearings on those new rules will happen later this month, something we will keep an eye on in the ongoing feud between the executive and legislative branches that has been on full display during the pandemic. Back with a final thought next. To the point. In Washington, two major proposals from the Biden administration are likely to be hot topics as we move through the spring. The possibility of Democrats going it alone on those two big spending plans is going to create continued polarization in the Capitol, a place where it is already difficult to create bipartisan plans simply because both sides have moved firmly into their corners, and at least for now, they're staying there. While in Lansing, Republicans and the governor will try to hammer out a budget while hammering each other's approach to the pandemic response. We'll be here to cover it every week. We hope you'll be here too. To the point.